Hey everyone, and welcome back to another process walkthrough video. This particular video is focused on the third piece in the Afterwork 3 set, the third out of 4 pieces. So you can find the previous 2 videos covering this piece and this piece. So this particular piece is basically following on from the sequence, right? We have the character who is back from presumably work, and she's drying her hair, she's tying her hair back up, and now, we're going to the fridge to get a drink. So this is basically a really simple, a really mundane type of storyline or plot, but the idea here is that I wanted something pretty simple to allow myself some space to do a bit of world building. Also, it's just something a bit more relaxed and, a chance for me to ease back into drawing after a month away. And so, yeah, without further ado, let us take a look at the piece. So this is the final result. We have the character basically walking towards the fridge. We have her coat in the background. We have the rain outside. My goodness, I noticed an error that I made here. I'll have to correct that as well. But basically, this is the final result. And let's take a look at how we made this. So to begin with, my idea here was that I wanted something low angle. I wanted to showcase a character walking towards something. Of course, there were many ways to do that, but seeing as that we have already had a full body view, we had a upper torso view, I thought why not have a low angle view that we can capture more of the scene with. And so this was the basic idea going into it. And as you can see here, right, this is the reference that I used. So really just I believe this was a stock image that I found. And it's just something really simple, right? Person walking away barefoot. And I think the pose itself, I think it's a really simple thing, right? Basically just learn from what you see, make good use of the reference, and apply it to your drawing. But I think the challenge here isn't so much as to draw this particular pose, but really is to think about how you want to frame the scene. So there are a couple of ways to do this, right? On one hand, right, what can we put behind the character? Or rather opposite the, character from our point of view. My initial option was to basically have the character walk to the balcony. Basically have stuff on the side of the balcony to show, and then the balcony, and then the outside, as you can see the potted plant here. But the problem with this particular setup, I felt, was that it didn't really feel like it was opening up to a next scene properly, right? Because I wanted to show the character grabbing something from the fridge. That was the idea that I had initially. And so this initial scene was sort of me skipping through that. In a way, this was actually intended to be the final frame, right? The third frame would be the character grabbing something from the fridge, and the fourth frame would be the character walking to the balcony. So I thought that I wanted to bridge the two scenes a little bit, so I decided to instead have this as the in-between frame. So what happens next is that I decided to start blocking out the rest of the surrounding scene and applying the low angle view. So as always, I recommend perspective tools 2, not sponsored by the way, but it's a really helpful plugin for Photoshop. I believe it is really compatible with a lot of versions. Now you can just drop in a point here, hit this button, and I've demonstrated this quite a couple of times, so I'll pass on it for today, but it will essentially draw a perspective grid for you really quickly. And I think that is really helpful, because honestly, having to draw a perspective grid manually every piece, every draft, that has got to be really tiring. That's really annoying. And speaking of that, another asset or texture that I created for myself is this sort of interlacing floorboards. Honestly, this is sort of a piece of my childhood. My grandma's house used to have this type of floorboards, and I thought it was pretty cool. It's kind of nostalgic for me. So I was like, why the heck not? This is pretty old school. This is pretty visually dense. It's interesting. Let's use it, and here we are. So in another way, complex patterns like this are pretty good, right? As long as they're repeating and they're even, uniform, they're really good for showing perspective, because you can simply grab the texture, right? Grab the texture, just do a quick demo here, and then do a bit of a distort, and then we can do perspective. And then we can even squeeze that down a bit. And then we have something that's in perspective, right? It really helps to have a nice even pattern. And the problem with simple grids, like a square gridded floorboard, square gridded tiles on the floor, is that sometimes they're a little bit too simple and I feel a little bit too artificial. So I think having a couple of more options in your arsenal is always great. So in this case, I applied these textures really quickly, and that was a great help in helping me establish sort of the floor plane, the foreshortening on the floor plane, because this is a low angle view, and then the rest of the scene as well. So the idea here was that I wanted to also make a connection between this particular scene and this particular scene, where we can see that the room outside is sort of pretty dark, whereas the room inside is well lit. So how do we show the transition of the character exiting a well lit room? Having the character be in complete shadow, it's a possibility. But you have to make a bigger leap of logic to make that connection, if you catch my drift, right? Because if we just suddenly show a character in darkness, it implies that the character has moved from the previous scene, but it's also possible to interpret this as a different character, which is an issue, of course. And so by having this sort of sliver of light being cut off by perhaps a door frame, I think this is a really good way to both highlight some details, because I always try to have at least some part of the drawing in light so that it's highlighted, but also it also allows us to make a connection to the previous scene where the similar warm light comes from before. And now in the coloring stage, that is also where things really help out, because we have this previous color setup, and here it's really both expedient and beneficial for us to carry this over, because previously here, this lighting setup generates this color scheme, right? So basically we simply want to carry it over to continue the implication that this light source is the same as this light source. So to connect the scenes with not only the forms and subjects of the drawing, but also color and light. So in a way, I think this is really, really helpful, and this could be one thing that you guys can consider while drawing connective scenes like this. And yeah, otherwise, really it's just about adding in a bit more color. For example, I decided to go for slightly more of a warm theme inside and cold theme outside. This is a really simple explanation, or really simple split that you can just try out a cold theme outside and a warm theme inside, and usually most of the time that is one way to make something pretty obvious, right? The cold warm split or vice versa is equally applicable and really useful. So this is it for the coloring stage, pretty much. Really just some very, very basic colors laid out in a pretty simple way. And here, as you can see here, I drew some apartments in the background for scale, which is important as well, because scale is a big issue when it comes to drawing more complex scenes, or rather drawing scenes in accurate detail as much as you can, right? Because of course we can draw, of course there's some margin for error. It's not a complete science. It's possible to use 3D software to help yourself with this as well. But for me, I'm someone who mostly eyeballs stuff unless it's a really complex scene, then I'll bring in reference to help myself. But here, it's pretty much eyeballed as long, but the key here is that, once again, we're talking about comparative differences, right? Because we need to make sure this apartment here is significantly smaller than whatever scale we have within our room here, because these two elements are really far apart. I wanted to feel like, I wanted the street to feel a bit more open, hence this, and whatever is in the background beyond this apartment is even more, or rather even smaller, right? Because we have big neon signs only being this big. We basically don't even draw the single windows to sort of imply the size of what is going on, as well as a little bit of lighting from below to help reinforce the light that we see above here, right? We want the light to come in from below and reflect onto the ceiling. So this is a pretty common way to introduce light to a scene. One way you guys can consider is like, for example, we're looking at a dark scene. How's the light supposed to come in, right? Because the idea of a cozy dark room is interesting, but when I'm trying to put it into a drawing, it doesn't always work. Or most of the time, it really doesn't work. You need some kind of light source to bring in visibility. You need people to see what's going on. Unless, in very niche circumstances, we just want it to be really, really dark. But here, a good way to do that is to have the light coming from below. And once again, right, recall cast shadows. Cast shadows are amazing for this purpose as well. The window grills, the railings, and sort of these window frames, rather, or whatever detail below, they cast shadows onto the ceiling. And these little blinds or louvered blinds, also cast really nice detailed shadows as well. So a couple of interesting things to take note in this current stage. And moving on to the next stage, is where we do a little bit more rendering. As you can see here, the background is sort of more rendered out. There's a bit more detail in the background, basically painting everything up to standard, right? For the character, right, painting the character is also important for us to pay attention to the forms that the reference provides us with. Because in this case, as someone who obviously has a drawn detailed anatomy a lot, I'm someone who is not too great there, still practicing, still learning. But the key here is to capture the basic forms, right? And this is what we're doing in the next stage, right? It doesn't need to be perfectly precise, but to capture the big relationship, for example, the arch of the foot, right? And the thickness of the ball of the foot, I think is really important. Hence the highlights here and the shadows here. And also importantly, sort of this side of the foot, right? The outside of the foot where it contacts the ground. Regardless of how arched your feet is, this area will contact the ground, and hence the highlights here. So as you can see, despite the different lighting, right, the completely different value here, but we still will transfer at least some of it over to really extract the form information from the reference, apply it to where we need them to. So drawing water droplets is also something that feels really daunting, but it's actually pretty easy. So all you really need to do is to do a dot and a C. Right, a dot and a C. The next thing you do is to give the C a bit of shadow, give the dot a bit of shadow, and then you might be wondering, you know, why do this? So my theory, or rather my understanding of it, my intuitive understanding of it is that basically because we are receiving a lot of reflection. Okay, let's talk about it this way. Let's say you are a light source. From your point of view, you're looking at a water droplet. Now, the interesting thing is that water droplets are obviously mostly transparent, so you can see some things beneath it. However, remember, you are at the point of view of a light source, right? Let's say you're a light source here, and then there's a water droplet here, and then there's like, you know, a wall behind. So, for example, you can see, let's say you can see the whole wall here, right? Because this thing is fully transparent, but notice that there are highlights on it, right? For example, if you see a highlight here, you don't see what's behind it. And what that translates to is that basically there's a total reflection of light at this particular point, resulting in a shadow from something beneath, despite the generally transparent water droplet. So that's kind of my understanding of it. Hopefully it helps you sort of figure out why there are, you know, shadows underneath a transparent object. But this is the way I like to draw it. Something really simple, but I think it's pretty effective as well. And similar to before, we use a little bit of texture brush to sort of highlight the transition areas with texture. It's a little bit overdone, right? As I mentioned, don't overdo it. Here, I overdo it just a little bit, I feel, but it's not too terrible. Similarly, the wooden floor, because these wooden floors are often waxed, to sort of preserve the wood and prevent them from rotting, it's going to be a little bit reflective, and hence there's sort of highlight and reflection that I used here. And we also use a couple of highlights on the edges because they are more likely to reflect light into our point of view. And yeah, so the next scene is where things change a little bit. So the next scene is where things change a little bit in here, right? Notice that the background is scaled up. So what I did here was to basically transition the scene from a broader scene into a narrower one. So basically, the idea is that we're using more of a longer lens camera rather than a super up close camera to capture the character walking towards the fridge. Because if you think about it, if we have a camera that would create this type of perspective difference between the scale of the character's body and the furniture in the background, that means we're that the implication is that we're really close to the character, right? And the problem with that is that actually, if we were that close, the visual perception of the character will be a lot more dynamic. It's going to be like way too dramatic, right? This is supposed to be sort of a calm scene. It's supposed to be a descriptive scene. So to sort of create a bit more distance, usually we're trying to get in close, right? We're trying to get in really close. We're trying to make the scene feel very intimate. We're trying to make the scene feel dynamic. In this case, we actually want to distance ourselves from the scene a little bit. And to do that, we could match the scale of the background to the foreground just a little bit more, right? So for example, the fridge is a bit bigger. Everything is basically just a little bit bigger. And I think that helps a lot in creating a feel of a more complete, or rather creates a feel of a more distant scene where everything is not so much, is less distorted by perspective, which I think is helpful as well. And yeah, this is basically it for this particular scene. And at the same time, right, having a smaller slice of external area here means we have a bit more challenge in demarcating it. However, what is also good is that we sort of close in the area here with a bit more focus, which is also good, right? Because recall that our objective here was to sort of transition the character from the bathroom to opening a fridge. So to open the fridge, she needs to walk to the fridge. And to walk to the fridge, in a big scene like this, it's less clear, right? Whereas in here, it's really clear where she's going. And the little negative space here, we can add in some raindrops, texture on its own to sort of highlight the light coming from outside, even though we no longer have the light cue on the ceiling. Right, we could transfer it to, say, the outer sort of, what do we call that? Outer canopy of the balcony as well. And yeah, so the light cues sort of remain, but we're more focused on the scene, and we're also trying to make it a bit more distant in a way. And so for the final scene, you know, it might look like nothing has changed, but actually I realized that the camera was feeling a little bit too close to the ground. What that meant was that, for example, there wasn't enough space between this and this versus this and this, right? Because as I mentioned, what this scene looked like is like the character is walking towards a tiny fridge, almost, right? To sort of work around that, I decided to space things up a bit, right? Because, for example, you can see there's a gap here, excuse me, between the bottom of this fridge and the bottom of this fridge. So the idea is to change the perspective just a little bit to correct any possible, you know, illusion or error here. And also we have some fridge magnets. Admittedly, not too much effort in these, but just a little bit of detail to sort of fill in the space here, and to also carry over to the next scene. And so this one's a pretty simple piece, basically just making a nice little transition. Couple small things to consider as well. Hopefully you have found this video helpful too. And as always, feel free to ask me any questions on things I've not covered in this. And yeah, let's move on to the next video and see you there.